What? Sure you can.
Sorry, thank you.
No problem. We're getting started. So if you've had children, not grandchildren, children, the difference between telling, the 1.5, 2-year-old child of what to do or what not to do, or if you've been a teacher to students or employer to employee, you can tell them what to do. And then, but at some point, particularly children, and maybe it's younger than we think, where you say, do this or don't do that, and then they say, why?
We need more notes.
Hand out. Oh, okay, well, I thought they were over there. All right, sorry.
We're going. Just wait a minute.
Anything else? Drinks, any food, any?
You're missing all of this. So the day comes when the child says why, the student says why, the employee says why, and the interesting thing, if you're the person telling someone to do something or not do something, and you have power and authority over them, then you can say, because I told you so. Until the person you're telling the what to do or what not to do sort of gains some type of authority, and then they can sort of fight back. So think about when you first became a Christian. I did when I was 15. And you say, now what? And of course people say, well, go to church. Okay, go to church. Read your Bible. Okay. Pray. Okay. Tell people about Jesus. Okay. And I was in high school, junior, and I'd take my Bible and put it on my textbooks and go from class to class like this is what you're supposed to do. And you can do that, but again, at some point Christians begin to ask, well, why? For example, like, why do I have to read my Bible? Or why do I have to go to church? And in the passage for tonight, in Hebrews 10, there's a very well-known what. If you've been around the church a while, it is, do not forsake the assembling together. And I was trying to think of all the times you've heard, most likely maybe the pastors or church leadership, you got to go to church, go to church, go to church, got to go. So I say all that in chapter 10, starting in verse 19 until actually rest of 10, 11, and 12, is really the what. Some very practical things of what we should be doing and not what we should not be doing as Christians. But for the most part, up until this point, what Hebrews has been doing is more or less focusing on the why. So for example, you say, well, why go to church or why, pray and do those things? Well, because Jesus is greater than the angels in chapter 1, and he's greater than Moses, and he's greater than Joshua. He's greater than Aaron because he's from the order of Melchizedek. And he's greater than the high priest because Jesus is our high priest. So if you think of, except for a few exhortations, chapter 1 of Hebrews all the way to the middle of chapter 10 is the why. It's who Jesus is. It's the theology. So tonight is you might say, the easy part. Okay, now we're going to finally get to the what. And there's going to be four things as Christians that are important that we should do, and actually 3 things we should do and 1 thing we should not do. But they're all founded upon what preceded it. So as an introduction, I have the last part of chapter 9, sort of a summary of that Jesus is our high priest. He's entered into the Holy of Holies once and for all, offered his sacrifice, his blood. So when talking about the why we should do what he's going to talk about tonight, it is directly connected to, because Jesus is our high priest. So think about this. You tell someone, you should read your Bible. Why? Well, because Jesus is your high priest. You should go to church. Why? Because Jesus is your high priest. And just sort of get a look on their face, like, what do you mean? What does being a high priest have to do with me going to church? Because the what is so tied to who Jesus is, and so, as we will see. So, chapter 10, verse 19, And you'll notice it's not a typical outline, Roman number 1, Roman number 2. But so verses 19 through 21 are going to deal with sort of just reviewing what has been shared already. So he says, therefore, okay, brethren, okay, so therefore he's making this transition. Since we have confidence to enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way, which he inaugurated for us through the veil, that is his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, so that's the introduction to what we're going to do. There's going to be 3 things: draw near, hold fast, and consider each other. But it's because that Jesus is our high priest. But it's when he says we have confidence, what? To enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus, new covenant with his flesh, and because he is the great priest. So we go back, we have the high priest. He only goes into the Holy of Holies once a year. So in a sense, the high priest is the only one who gets to have, we'd say today, a personal relationship with God. That's the very presence of God as he brings the blood of the goat on the mercy seat. So only one person once a year got to be, if you will, experience the very presence of God. Maybe he told the other priests, but no one ever got to go in. And I haven't thought, if you were the high priest, and then Day of Atonement's over, you think, I don't get to share this with anybody. I got to go in there. It's lonely. It's just me and God. So Jesus comes, and using that as the analogy of the spiritual, figurative language, Jesus ascends into heaven, goes into the very presence of God, the mercy seat in heaven, sits down, presents his blood sacrifice. So Jesus has torn the curtain, and now Jesus is in the presence of God because he is the high priest. But this time, unlike the high priest of the Old Testament, he goes in, he comes out, but no one else gets to go in. But Jesus goes into the Holy of Holies in the heavens, and he tears the curtain down so that we can go in to the Holy of Holies. We talk about a lot of times about having a personal relationship with Jesus, like, just you and Jesus. And it's true, become a Christian, Holy Spirit comes, you got the scriptures. But the thing is that when you and I are having a personal relationship with Jesus, we're having a personal relationship with Jesus along with everybody else. So in a sense, the Holy of Holies is crowded. So the confidence is, we have confidence to go in, because Jesus has torn down the curtain. We can now be in the presence of God because of his holy sacrifice, and because Jesus is the high priest, not just over the tabernacle, but he's the high priest over the entire house of God. And there are 2 interesting terms he uses in the beginning: brethren, and then refers to as the house of God. That this is the family-orient part. So as we look at the 4 things that we are to do, we do them together. And what it particularly is going to eliminate this idea that you can have a personal relationship with Jesus, have devotional time, you and the Lord under a tree, outside, in your bedroom, but you don't need other Christians. You don't need to be a part of a local church. You don't need to interact with other Christians. You can just do it by yourself. And the lead up to this is you can't. If you want to be in the presence of God and have this personal relationship with him, spiritually speaking, to go into the Holy of Holies with God, then you do so with everybody else. So if you had siblings, maybe this will understand this idea. I have three brothers, and when we were all in elementary school, my dad designed this house, and so he built this house. It had 5 bedrooms because he said, I'm going to give you each your own bedroom because I'm tired of you fighting with each other. So here we are. We each have our own bedroom, and what happened is we didn't spend much time together, at least I didn't. So you live in the house together, but I could just be in my room, shut the door, and then if, Tom would come in, I'd say, Mom, Tom's in my room, or hey, Doug's in my room. And I was thinking, in a sense, people become Christians and said, shut the door. I'm just going to have a personal relationship with Jesus, but I don't want anyone else in my room. And so that's the build-up to this. There's no such thing as just me and Jesus. Okay, so what are we to do? And it's really, there's three things, but they're all tied together. It's drawing near. So verse 22. Let us draw near, okay, go towards. And then he tells us how we're drawing near. With a sincere heart, as opposed to unsincere. In full assurance of our faith that we trust God because he has saved us and we have confidence in what he has done, not in our works. And then he says, having our hearts sprinkled clean with an evil conscience, and he uses the imagery of the Old Testament, sprinkling the blood on the altar, that Jesus has sprinkled his blood upon us to clear our evil conscience. And then our bodies washed with pure water. So you would wash, the priest had a water basin before they bring the animal sacrifice, and of course also all the way up until the idea of baptism. So we draw near to God because God has made us clean. He's purified us. He's washed us off. He's justified us so we can enter his presence. Okay. We are then to let us hold fast. And these are the commands. So the command is draw near. And then 2, hold fast. So let us hold fast the confession of our hope. So we make a profession, I believe in Jesus, and believe in the scriptures and all that comes along with that. So I'm to hold on to that. It's like cling tight of our hope without wavering. For he who promised is faithful. The third command is, let us consider, and the word consider, this is great, literally means keep your eyes on each other. Be aware of one another. Know what's going on with each other's lives. Instead of saying, not my responsibility, you can do what you want. I don't have to be involved in your life. Just it's me and Jesus. So he says, consider, and then he says how to stimulate one another. Okay, stimulate. Think about, I'm going to say electric shock, but it's a positive and negative. You stimulate somebody to do positive things, to encourage people to do 2 things: to love God and love one another, and good deeds, their behavior. But you're also stimulating them when they're not loving and when they're not involved in good deeds. You're stimulating them to love and to do good deeds. I'm going to skip down to the third one. Encouraging one another, okay? And all the more as you see the day drawing near. I was watching the track meet for the past 3 days in Drake. On the final day, there's probably about 15,000, 16,000 people, which is a lot of people for a high school track meet. And this one girl, one of the races she won, and she was from my high school, but that's beside the point. So then she runs, and her mom and dad run down to the railing, and then her dad, because he's up here, he just picks her up because she weighs like 8 pounds, picks her up, hugging her, and the mom comes down, and they're just having this nice little encouraging thing, and I just thought, that's what we're doing. Encourage one another. All the more as you see the day drawing near, time is short. Sandwiched between that then is the more well-known passage, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is the habit of some. So first of all, there's 3 things about these commands. The first one, drawing near, has a focus on faith. The second one, hold fast, a focus on hope. And the third one, consider each other, a focus on love. And so they build each other. We draw near to God. We hold on to our hope in Jesus. And while we're doing that, we're doing it together. Watching everybody. And so, and you and I, we've all been around church long enough to know, when something finally comes out in a church setting that's, not appropriate and wrong or scandal or something, And oftentimes people then say, "Oh yeah, I had some questions, or I saw some clues, but it wasn't my responsibility," or, "I don't have a reason to ask questions and get involved." And this passage says we have to, because we're all in the Holy of Holies together with Jesus. We're all together, and so the coming together isn't just like going to church, but it's what you're doing when you go to church. Because it's very possible. In fact, I was at one church that I was speaking at, and it was very dark, and they closed the doors, but that way you could see when people were coming in late. But when it was over, I went out in the lobby, and I was just noticing, like I would say, a fairly large number of people like zooming out. And I was talking to one of the elders, and he said, "Yeah, that's one of the problems we have. Like people just come and then they leave. They don't hang around." And you can do that. I went to church. It isn't just I went to church or I went to a meeting. It's what are we doing when we're gathered together and encouraging each other. And of course, it's beyond just Sunday morning. It's all the time. When you're having lunch with somebody, another believer, you're, formal and informal things. So it's constant. But the bottom line is to have a intimate personal relationship with Jesus, because he has made the way for us, involves I have to look around and see who else is in the Holy of Holies, because I'm responsible. We are responsible for each other. Let me stop there and sort of anything come to mind, reflect ideas with this idea of our responsibility with each other, and not just me and Jesus.
I missed the coffee in here somewhere.
You missed the what?
Coffee.
The coffee.
Yeah.
That's not That's the coffee.
It's not.
Well, it is interesting because churches used to have fellowship halls, and then the megachurch model, they changed it to the lobby. So you fellowship in the lobby to hang out. And yes, but the koinonia of fellowship that the scriptures talk about is so much more than just, "Hey, hi, how you doing?" It's again, this idea of keeping your eyes on each other. And then I was thinking about, as parents, your 3, 4, 5-year-old child is, out playing in the backyard. More so for the mothers and the fathers, keeping your eye on your kids. Or sometimes maybe you've been somewhere and the parents aren't watching the kid, and you're over there going, the kid's getting pretty close to getting in trouble. So.
Well, it would include the breaking bread together and all of the stuff from Acts 2.
Mm-hmm.
Part of that.
Well, it doesn't have to be huge. I mean, there are times when we really have to dig in with each other, and there are people that I know I can call on, who are my friend, to pray, and take care of us. But then, there's Kathy, so sweet. I mean, just those little reminders throughout the week. I'm thinking of you, those sweet, those funny. Sometimes I'm laughing. I have to have my phone beside me at school because I have to always be in contact to see if something's going on at school. But then sometimes there's a ding, and I laugh out loud in the middle of class because Kathy has seen something. That's just too funny. It's too cute. But it's just, it's little, but it means a lot.
Mhm.
That connection.
It's
Somebody's thinking. It is. It's
Yeah.
thinking about you.
Yeah.
You're important to me. That's important.
And the ability to draw near to God, people say, "Well, I want to have a closer relationship with God," is directly dependent upon each other. So we're formally and informally in the coming together, that's what we're doing with each other. We're helping each other. in growing, and that's why you need all different types of people in your life. Some more than others, but you need this wide, selection of people, as opposed to I'll just do it by myself.
To say, when I'm doing my devotions and stuff, God brings to mind so many of you and so many other brothers and sisters. I mean, I can't possibly do it just me. Because you are all involved in my life and
Mm-hmm.
and my life with Christ especially. So it's like when I'm reading and God brings to mind somebody, God brings to mind somebody else then. Or God brings to mind, maybe you should call somebody for it, because and you're right, it's not a solo thing. We're all in it together.
So I'm so thankful that of the fellowship with this group, because I see that congregations do not have that same fellowship, and especially in the Lutheran churches that I'm involved with. And it's sad. Because they keep talking, each individual church keeps talking about their ministry, and yet they're failing the ministry of their people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the assembling together is greatly enhanced by a group like this. If you're in a big church, you have to have something like this, or you have to have the choir, or you have to have somewhere where you are spending time with people to know who they are. And so in the big room, when everybody's darting about from place to place, and you see somebody who's a part of your group, stop and talk and share and spend a little bit of time instead of just saying, hey, bye. Which is why it makes you want to go back to church.
Mhm.
Every time you can find time to go, because you see your friends and your buddies, and you want to get caught up on things, and do that because you care about each other, because you've been a part of a small group.
I've been to a couple of churches that didn't have small groups, didn't have Sunday schools. Sunday school at first was, a long time ago, was where you got to know people well, and then some churches quit having Sunday schools. I don't know why they did that, but they did. I guess the adults thought they knew everything, but so then the small groups kind of started up because, and it was God brought that about because He saw that people were not getting to know each other, and they needed to.
And there's also a dynamic of needing people that you might think you don't need, or people you think, well, we don't have anything, we don't have much in common. So, for example, so I think about the church setting, of how churches have done Sunday schools, particularly in the past, particularly on age. So you could be in a class of people in their, our age, and not have any or little contact with, high school kids or college age kids. And you might think, well, why do I need to hang around a 18-year-old? And they think of the same thing. They're in their age appropriate groups. And why do they need to be around us old people? Now, I thought that'd be at the college, being around college kids all the time, about eventually what they have done, and then coming here where I'm the young one of the younger ones, with you very wise people. But it's we need each other, but we need each other of different ages and different backgrounds and different spiritual gifts, because they all they bring apart. So on the one hand, you can say to people, small groups are good, and it's good to have fellowship, but it comes with a challenge. Because if you're going to do that, then more people are going to know about your life, particularly things you don't want them to know. So in a sense, it's more comfortable to keep at a distance. So this section ties into the next part, verses 26 and on. It's a warning, and he says, "For if we go on sinning willfully, after receiving the knowledge of the truth," he says two things. There no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. If you're going to reject Jesus, and he's the only way to forgive you of your sins, there's no sacrifice beyond Jesus. And two, but a terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of fire which will consume the adversary. So there's a warning about sinning willfully. So a couple things. The word willfully in the Greek, the Greek word for willfully is the first word in the sentence. And the Greek text does that when it wants to emphasize it. So the emphasis is on willingly. But the willingly is, people say, well, is there a particular sin? It's a continual willful sinning until, for how long? Either until Jesus comes back or until you die. So it isn't just, because we get chapter 11, different people, Abraham and others who sinned along the way. It's this continual sinning of rejecting Jesus, rejecting Jesus as your high priest, rejecting his sacrifice, rejecting the salvation that he gives. But it's a continuing to do it. I say that because if we know people who have left the church and maybe have left Jesus, they're not without hope, because even people like that can still, if later down the road, be brought back. And so you're talking about continually sinning. You're continually sinning and rejecting. Obviously, once you die, then you can't. It isn't like when you continually sin. If you continually sin for a year, then you're under judgment. You're continually sinning, because the idea here is he's going to talk later about, but even people can have a deathbed conversion, or reconversion, if you will, to come back. But if you ask the question, how is it that someone who has received the knowledge of truth of Jesus, how is it at some point would they then willfully, decisively continue to reject Jesus? What would create a situation where someone would do that? And it is tied to what comes before. It is separating yourself from each other. So, stimulate one another to love and good deeds. Don't forsake assembling, encouraging one another. If you stop doing that, you do forsake the assembling. You don't have people to encourage you. You don't have people to stimulate you. In other words, you isolate yourself from believers. Is when you will put yourself in a position to, as we say, slowly, willfully reject Jesus. So there's a grave warning here to saying, well, I can't believe so-and-so, isn't a part of the church anymore. And I've heard this from some people I know that have left the church, and then they'll say, I've been gone for a year. People know that I don't really believe in Jesus anymore. But nobody from the church has come by to see how I'm doing. It's sort of this, they think I'm gone. And this warning is, yes, there are people who are moving away. But instead of, even for us saying, well, they're done, it's still saying no to, how can you stimulate, encourage someone that has left, at least outwardly has left. And instead of saying, it's helpless, to say no. So I had lunch with, a former student a number of years ago who used to be a worship leader who has nothing to do with God anymore. And when I had lunch with him, there was this sense of, like, why are you having lunch with me? Like, don't you know I don't go to church anymore? And I don't really believe in, Jesus anymore. Why would you continue to talk to me? So, the two things, they're not a sacrifice. The idea is Jesus is the only way. So if you reject Jesus. But it's the idea of judgment. And this is the part that the idea of, well, God forgives you and he's saved you by grace, and once saved, always saved, then how can there be a judgment? Think of it as someone who, well, I have a student who is slowly failing. They gone from A, now they're down to a D, and they skip a couple classes, and I tell them, look, you haven't failed yet, but you're on the road to failing. And there's a judgment at the end of the semester. This warning isn't to wait until someone has openly rejected Jesus and walked away, but it's a warning for people who haven't even fully done it yet. We do it when we warn people before they fall off the cliff. We warn them. There's a cliff there. In other words, there's a warning for all of us that we all can be in a position where we get separated and slowly sort of drift away, and then one day people go, "Where's so and so?" and they're gone. So it's an important warning. Then I'm going to finish this part, and then we'll reflect on it. He then sort of digresses. Well, he's going to explain more about this judgment. So verse 28 on the second page. You say, what do you mean? People who have continually sinned, walked away from God. What kind of judgment are you talking about? So verse 28 says, anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. So in the Old Testament, if you set aside the law, you only need 2 or 3 witnesses in certain crimes to bring about the death penalty. Not everything was death penalty, and we know enough about the Old Testament to see the judgment of God throughout the Old Testament. He then says, verse 29, how much severe punishment do you think he will deserve? Who, 3 things, trampled underfoot the Son of God. 2, has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified. And 3, has insulted the Spirit of grace. So we think of Old Testament judgment, New Testament grace and forgiveness. New Testament is just God loves you and there's no judgment. Writer of Hebrews says, in this rhetorical question, a greater judgment for rejecting Jesus than the judgment placed upon those in the Old Testament. And I think, and for many of us would think, if you said there's a judgment for those under the New Testament, the New Covenant, worse than the judgment under the Old Covenant, and it's the 3 things he says: trampled, to step on. It's the idea of like a herd of pigs going through a field, or horses running, or cows getting loose in the field. A stampling. Okay, you're trampling upon Jesus. So this is someone who's already believed in Jesus, accepted him, baptized, been a part of a congregation, and then walks away. Has regarded as unclean, that's to repudiate. That says, I'm now going to take what Jesus did on the cross, his perfect sacrifice, and I'm going to make it unclean. I don't need to believe in Jesus. I don't need to believe in his covenant. And then he has insulted the Spirit of grace. And one of the ideas there, to insult someone, is also the idea of to spit upon somebody. And by the way, these 3 things are sort of characterized when you go back and read about Jesus' arrest, the trial, and his crucifixion, of what happened to him. In other words, if you look at the Jewish leaders, Caiaphas, Annas, the Pharisees, and how they responded to Jesus, in that physical sense, in the sense spiritually speaking, of what he's talking about. Now, when Jesus died, raised us from the dead, wasn't to say that the Jews and the Pharisees and Caiaphas and so forth, that they didn't have an opportunity for salvation. They would have had they believed in Jesus. We know a few, the thief on the cross. We know about Nicodemus. But it gives you the imagery of what we're talking about people who have experienced the grace of God. So then he says in verse 30, and he brings in the Old Testament, for we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. And that's from Deuteronomy 31 and 32. It's called the Song of Moses. So here it is, Deuteronomy. Moses is preparing the people to enter the promised land. And Moses tells them, I have there quoted, he says, Moses says, I know that after my death you will surely act corruptly and turn aside from the way that I have commanded you. And in the days to come, evil will befall you because you will do what is evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger through the work of your hands. And that's what the writer of Hebrews now quotes here to say. People become Christians, but then they at some point, in a sense, act in a way in which the Jews did when they're in the wilderness of turning away from Jesus. And that's when then ties in verse chapter 32 about vengeance is mine. The Lord will vindicate his people. And then verse 31, sort of the summary of this, it is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So, let me stop with this part. Because this part is well, I don't know, you tell me.
Well, it didn't say jump. It didn't say it's a terrifying thing to jump into the hands of the living God. Falling sounds like a oops. Or going along my way and all of a sudden the Lord disappeared and now I'm falling into the hands of God. Like almost an unexpected result. If you spend in, if you work at the word fall, we all will fall, but we just don't know when. And or we fall every day, I guess. Not necessarily, but at some point we will make the last fall. And if we haven't been against Christ all that time, then we fall into the hands of the loving God. But if without that, we do fall. So it's interesting that they use the word fall. I don't know, maybe that I make too much of the English version of the word. But,
Well, yes, but grammatically in terms of how it's put together, it's you go back to verse 26, isn't falling, sinning, unexpectedly, but it's sinning, it's progressive, present progressive. You go on sinning willfully. That's what he's talking about. It isn't just like all of a sudden I woke up and went, oh, sorry God. It's a willful decision that I'm going to walk away from Christ and I'm going to continue to do it.
You willfully took the wrong road.
Yes. If you're looking for examples in the New Testament, one might look to Judas. And they contrast Judas with Peter, because they're both rebuked. And then their response, how Judas responded, how Peter responded. Now, if you're going to ask the question, okay, but people, well, is Judas in hell, and losing your salvation? I put it in the title. One of the authors said, we asked the question, can you lose your salvation? And then this one author made the comment. Hebrews doesn't necessarily answer that question. What he's addressing is, how can Christians keep your salvation? How can you grow in your salvation? And you say, okay, so I was thinking, so I present my syllabus to my class students. I go, this is what you need to do to, do well in the class. And then someone says, but what if I don't do the assignment? Or what if I, skip class? in a sense, one way to look at this is that the emphasis is on, instead of looking at, well, what are the consequences if I don't do this? Or what's the least amount I have to do to get by? As opposed to, what is the most that I can do to follow Jesus because he's my high priest and entered into the Holy of Holies? The motivation behind this isn't telling people, okay, if you do, these 5 things, you're out. Here's the line. Get the closest to the line. The focus of Hebrews is, because of what Jesus has done, our high priest, and entered into the Holy of Holies and forgiven us our sins once and for all, how can I now gladly worship him and obey him and follow him out of love and gratitude for him? It's reversing the strategy of trying to motivate people to follow Jesus, as opposed to what's the least amount I have to do versus what's the most. And when I have a student, a couple years ago, I had a student who was exceptional writer, and they could write the paper and then they could revise it, and she was one of 2 students revised it, and I made sure that she already had a 98. And when I said, "Why are you revising it?" and she said, "Well, because I'm not perfect yet. I want to get better." And I contrast that with a student who's sort of the opposite. What's the least amount I have to do to pass through the class? And so here she is saying, "What's the most I can do?" And she wrote more than she needed to. She went beyond, as opposed to the student who sits back there going, "Okay, I'm going to plot out. How can I just barely?" And that's the shift. Instead of what's the least amount you and I have to do and still go to heaven, it's telling people what's the most I can do because of what Jesus has done as my high priest. And it flips it so much. So
I had some students in here that, well, they really to cheat. Really did. And they came up with ingenious ways to cheat.
sure.
And when I found out about how they were cheating, I said, if you didn't put that much effort into learning it, instead of how you could not learn it, you would be genius. But now you're in trouble.
So
But it seems to me that, you were talking about people who were turning away, and if it's somebody that is telling you they don't believe in Jesus anymore, this is what they need to know. And it seems to me like, it's a terrible thing to fall into the hands of the living God. That should be weighing on their mind, in the back of their mind all the time, that they're rejecting Jesus. And so reminding him of this should maybe give them, at some point in their life, maybe not right now, but some point in their life, they may think, I don't want to fall into the hands of the wicked.
And this is really the positive and negative. Do this, draw near. The negative, don't do that. You tell your kids, do this, but don't do that. They're both of helping each other.
Sue's trying to say something.
What?
Well, I'm not really sure. Well, because I'm listening and I'm pondering, and people, do they just wake up one day and say, none of this makes sense and I'm gone? And maybe it happens both ways. Or is it little bit by little bit, like the world gets in, they stop believing certain truths, just like the devil saying, did God really say? When you let these little things get in your brain that start working on you, then you get to the point where you're walking away. But that's part of, if we're gathering and if we know one another, we should be able, obviously in this group, I don't think, it's an assumption we make. We're not going to worry about that with any of us in here. But if you're gathering and you get to know people and you see those things, then you talk to them and find out where they're coming from, and what's bothering them, and help remind them of truth, instead of just like, they're allowed to get all that place where they fall off the radar, and all of a sudden you go, oh, well, where have they been? I mean, I haven't been through this with anybody, so I don't know the truth of it. Like, I don't know people who have deliberately walked away like you have, Doug. But it just seems like part of that is why we gather, so that we can lift each other up and encourage one another. And when we're having doubts, because honestly, I think we all have doubts, we all have questions, we have those things, but instead of letting them take hold of us and letting them get out of control, then we know we've got people where we go, I need you to help me, like I am struggling with this, or they don't want to help, but somebody else comes in and says, I see some things with you that are going on, like what's causing this? Where's your thinking right now? What are you dealing with? Maybe, I mean, it just seems like there's less chance of somebody going off the deep end if they have people they're really held accountable with and trust to talk to about these things. I don't know. Just random.
Well, my nephew and his wife have gone through a tough time. They felt like God wasn't answering their prayers. That was the big thing about her niece. And, I mean, they were really doubting a lot. And it was, and I don't have access to them like other people. And he's in the praise team at his church and everything. But they were really struggling there because they saw destruction of her niece, and they were praying and praying, and it didn't look like God was doing it. So I don't know if anybody at their church came up with them or anything. I don't know anything about it, but I do know that my sister and all of her friends and we have been praying for them. And I don't know how tenuous it is now. But
It's like you gotta have people who recognize that in you and be willing to walk through that hard stuff with you.
Well, the author's actually going to give us next in verses 32 a major, say, factor as to why someone might willfully walk away. So he says in verse 32, but remember the former days, okay, when after being enlightened, so go back and remember the early days of your conversion, okay? But look at what he wants you to remember. You endured a great conflict of sufferings. Why wouldn't you want to say, you need to remember the good times. You need to remember the blessings. You need to remember the times that God did answer your prayers. He says, this is a command, remember the sufferings. Now, sufferings, he'll give 4 examples, plays a factor, you might say major factor, as to why people leave. God didn't answer my prayer. God didn't do what I wanted to do. God disappointed me. The church hurt me. And you just fill in the blanks. So what is it about remembering your former sufferings is going to be a means?
Endured them.
What?
It says you endured.
Yes.
endured.
Yes, exactly. So he's going to give us what were just 4 examples of the sufferings that they endured. You can sort of, put your life next to these. First, in your public ridicule, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches and tribulations. So some type of public opposition to them being believers in Jesus. We don't know the historical specifics behind this.
Like being stoned.
What?
Like being stoned.
Mm-hmm. But being a Christian, they were being publicly, there was opposition. Then he says, and one of the reasons why there was this publicly spectacle taking place, partly by becoming sharers with those who were so treated. So someone is being persecuted, publicly ridiculed, another Christian comes along, okay, encourage one another, stimulate one another, then you then become the one who's now suffering because you're going to walk alongside someone. And if you're interested, when it says becoming sharers, it's the Greek word for fellowship. This is Psalm 23. Although I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. So now he's saying one of the elements of helping each other is that we walk with each other when you are suffering. Now you're going to suffer too, but it's one of the ways to help people. Then he says, for you showed sympathy to the prisoners. So not only did you shared with those that were being so treated, but you also had sympathy, you had compassion, you were walking alongside those that were in prison. And the context are people who were being put into prison because they were Christians. And then he says, and you accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing that you have for yourselves a better possession and a lasting one. So these are people who have endured those four things. And so in the past. So he says to them, there's a warning about drifting away. So you need to remember how you endured the sufferings in your past, and that your ability to endure through the sufferings was because there were others who were walking with you. In other words, to keep your eye on each other and to have another brother and sister who was suffering, particularly for being a Christian, and then not intervening and sort of standing back and just say, well, that's not my responsibility. It's the opposite. Say, well, I don't want to get involved because if I get involved, then I might too experience some of it. And that would be correct. Then I'm going to take on your suffering, if you will, by walking with you through that. And I mean, one of the things for you to sort of think of maybe in your own life, someone that maybe came along in your life and walked with you through a time in your life where maybe you had questions or doubts and where is God, et cetera, and somebody came alongside and helped you through it. I don't know what's happened to all this, but
When he said, you showed sympathy to the prisoners, he's talking about himself too, because he was in prison, and they hated him.
I mean, for me, 11 years ago, it was Keith Kepley who publicly walked alongside me of all the stuff that happened. And then this group. And since he says to remember, I'm going to be obedient. About 11 years ago, about just being done with church and being done with all this junk and all this stuff. And then God birthed this group. Personally, why I'm here. And so, you get somebody isolated from other people. They're suffering, but then they're isolated from people. And there's no one there to help them along the way. So 35. This is the second thing. Remembering you enduring the suffering in the past. How those people have helped you. The second thing is, therefore, do not throw away. That's the idea of like throwing away trash. Do not throw away your confidence. Confidence in Jesus as the high priest. He saved us. The confidence that we have each other as a body, believers. which has a great reward. So now there's an incentive about promise of heaven, eternity, that confidence that we have of one day entering into that eternal kingdom. Don't get rid of that, particularly in the midst of present day suffering. So he says you need a couple things. For you have need of endurance, so that when you've done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. You need endurance, and you need obedience, to continue to obey, because there's a reward to receive what was promised. And then he goes into explanation of why we need endurance and why we need to be faithful in our obedience. Verse 37, for yet in a very little while, that's from Isaiah 26:20. He's going to combine two passages. He's going to combine that with Habakkuk. He says, but he who is coming will come and will not delay. Okay, Jesus is coming. And then he says, but my righteous one shall live by faith. So Jesus is coming back, so we are to live by faith until Jesus comes back. And his if he shrinks back, okay, my soul has no pleasure in him. And Habakkuk, one of the minor prophets we talked about, when he talked about, it may seem slow, but wait for it. It will surely come, will not delay. The righteous shall live by faith. But then in verse 39 he says, but we are not of those who shrink back to destruction. So the people he's writing to, they've not abandoned the faith. So what he's been telling them is a warning, but he's not saying, look, you guys are already lost. He's saying, you're not. But he's warning them. It could lead down the road. He says, but of those who have faith to the preserving of the soul. So remember the times when you did endure suffering. So, again, I was thinking about if you experience any type of, again, I'm going to say suffering directly because you're a Christian or just suffering because of the life we live. And you've gone through something in your life, and then you meet someone who has a shared experience, and then what happens in a sense how it connects you to them. And say, oh, I've been through that too. Oh, I've been through that too. There's this connection. And that shared suffering and shared endurance of suffering and shared obedience during the suffering is a great way to then connect us to other people, to bond us together, to say, you listen to people who have been in war together and they make it through. So when you've been through something that's been extremely painful, and so one of the ironies is that the part of sharing together is sharing the suffering and struggles and doubts and fears that you've had, instead of saying, going to a church where everything's happy, and everybody looks great, and I don't want people to really know. And for me, that's one of the parts of this group, is that we do that. Isn't just, well, I don't want to, share with what's really going on. And the writer of Hebrews says, well, actually, you need to. And this is going to go back to, well, why? We have this great high priest. But the great high priest of Jesus is because he suffered and sacrificed his own blood, died, rose again, ascended to heaven. And so the means of our salvation through his suffering is now the means by which we share our lives, which includes our suffering. We share it with each other, as opposed to not. And then people say, well, I would share, but everybody seems to have everything together in their lives, so I don't want to seem like, which is detrimental to when you find out, oh, really? You deal with the same things I do? So then the end of chapter 10 then leads into chapter 11, which we'll look next week. Chapter 11, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for. So the famous chapter, Hebrews chapter 11, faith is tied to further explain what does it mean to have faith, and then all the examples he's going to give us in chapter 11 of people who had faith, but they weren't people who had everything perfect, but they're people who continued on. So before we get into the Lord's Supper, which really just sort of a summary of what we've been doing, Any reflections or things you want to comment on or stood out to you?
One of the things about suffering and enduring and coming through on the other side is so that we can help someone else who has suffered in sometimes in a similar way. You know, I won't say a name.
You want me to turn it off?